Good day and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. In last week's episode, we flew around the periphery of the American War of Independence to learn about why not everyone wanted to join the Patriots and what happened to those that didn't. The Continental Congress tried to assert itself onto all British colonies on the continent, and from that sense, the American War of Independence was only a partial victory. Many colonists became independent, and many remained under the Crown. Once an armistice was called and peace declared, Loyalist refugees fled or were forced out of the new free United States, 40,000 of them to settle in Canada. Today we're going to take a look at the Treaty of Paris, then the Loyalists on the move. Not all Loyalists were British. Not all were white. They settled in the Maritimes, in Quebec, and more importantly for us, in what's now Ontario, and eventually into the Ottawa area. The story of the Loyalists is the story of the founding of New Brunswick and Ontario in the wake of the American War of Independence. The American War of Independence started with enthusiasm, with disgruntled colonists against their Crown government. Then the disgruntled and the gruntled colonists, who were actually fine with things the way they were, got involved. The indigenous nations, who had treaty obligations but didn't want to get involved in what seemed to be a family feud among the Anglophones, were being coerced into the conflict. Then the French, and eventually the Spanish and Dutch got involved. Mainly, the Europeans were using the conflict to try to contain Britain. But the British colonies included large swaths of territory and people that had once been under the dominion of the Kingdom of France and the Dutch Republic. What was going to be the divide when the dust settled? In April of 1782, colonist and royal decided to send representatives to Paris to finally hammer out a mutually beneficial peace that would work in everyone's best interests. The treaty involved all-power negotiation, and Spain wanted to keep on fighting in order to secure Gibraltar. If France had any designs on Quebec, they weren't a part of the negotiations. France simply wanted its Mississippi trading monopolies restored. The United States made half-hearted demands for Quebec and Nova Scotia, but would settle for fishing rights off of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, as well as in the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. The U.S. got dominion past their existing borders, going all the way up to the Mississippi, granting them an overlord status over the indigenous nations therein, and a status similar to that enjoyed by the Crown before them. Both Britain and the United States agreed to compensate those who had lost property during the conflict, and the individual states were obligated to assist with Loyalist claims for restitution. This promise was met with varying degrees in different colonies. A recurring theme of diplomatic treaties is that the rights of states and the responsibilities of citizens are to be honored, but the responsibilities of states and the rights of citizens would not always be at the forefront. In the end, separate peace treaties were signed between Britain and the United States, Britain and France, Britain and Spain, and Britain and the Netherlands. The Treaty of Paris might have been more accurately described as the Treaties of Paris. They were signed in September of 1783, 16 months after the peace conference began. Many of the Loyalists stayed in the United States and were eventually integrated into the new country. However, 42,000 white Loyalists, taking with them 2,000 enslaved black people, immigrated to Canada. 3,500 free black people and 3,400 Haudenosaunee also fled to Canada. 7,000 whites and 5,000 free blacks went to Britain. 12,000 whites and 6,500 enslaved blacks were taken to Florida and the Caribbean. For those of you keeping a tally, that's 81,400 souls. That would be significant today. But in the 1780s, that was a global refugee push. Most of the settlers into Canada, that's 30 of the 44,000, landed in Nova Scotia. This was so much of a demographic challenge to the status quo that some had to be settled on Cape Breton Island, previously almost uninhabited, and the Nova Scotia government insisted on settling as many as possible along the St. John River, populating the new border with the United States. So many settled on the western shore of the Bay of Fundy that a new provincial government had to be created to administer them. That is the foundation of New Brunswick. As many as 3,500 free black people came to Nova Scotia. Some came fearing enslavement, or the possibility of re-enslavement, at the hands of the victorious Americans, drunk on their newfound institutions of freedom and liberty. Some came for the promise of land grants for Loyalists after the war. While I would love to play the part of the snide Canadian, admonishing the brutal racism of the United States, things weren't really that great in Nova Scotia for the black Loyalists. They were the last to receive their land grants, by which time all of the choice land was already given away to white farmers. The land grants that they were given were not ratified by provincial officials, and could, and often were, taken and redistributed to white settlers after the free blacks had cleared the land of rocks and trees and set up farmland. When they tried to resist this expropriation in 1783, we have Canada's first recorded race riot, when they were pushed off the land. Slavery was outlawed earlier in Canada than the United States, but the lived conditions were such that patriotic Canadians should not find themselves on too high of a horse on this one. It was definitely better than slavery. But that's not actually the ringing endorsement that some people seem to think it is. 1,200 of the 3,500 black men and women who had fled to Canada decided to continue to pursue greener pastures and continued back to Africa to settle in Sierra Leone. Loyalist refugees also followed the same flow as the Quebec invasion at the beginning of the war. They mustered on Lake Champlain and followed the Richelieu River north, some settling in and around Fort St. John, the Sorel where the river met the St. Lawrence, and the site of Samuel de Champlain's important victory against the Mohawks in 1610. From there they settled along the St. Lawrence in Montreal, Quebec City, and the eastern townships. The settlers, who were a part of this generation, were given the honorific U.E. for use so they might sign their name John Smith U.E., indicating their status as a United Empire Loyalist who had settled in Canada after the war. While the term Quebec includes Ontario all the way up to Thunder Bay, up to the border of Rupert's Land in the Hudson Bay watershed, arguing about terms for the land hasn't been an issue up to this point, because there really haven't been enough people calling it home for that to matter. Fort Frontenac, Dieppe, Agincourt, Bordeaux, and Paris could be seen on the map, as could Taranto. Generally speaking, these French settlements were trading posts and forts. And since the English took over, they'd had their hands full with Pontiac's War and the Yankee Rebellion, and were not able to populate and settle the territory. Refugees started flowing from the war to the south, and settlements were arranged. 7,500 Loyalists came to settle, mostly on the borderlands of the Niagara Peninsula, the Windsor side of the Detroit River, and the Bay of Quinte area. While these were new English settlements, the province was still the province of Quebec. What that meant on a practical level was that the seigneurial system was expected to be used for these new settlements. Royal seigneuries began to take form around Cornwall and then around the Bay of Quinte. The difference between the seigneuries in what's now the province of Quebec and the royal seigneuries that were emerging in the now province of Ontario, then still Quebec, was that traditional seigneuries were leased out as tax farms to land developers who would then maintain the district and rent out individual plots of land to local farmers. The seigneur was a quasi-feudal figure who would have responsibilities to their seigneur in the form of rents and labor. The royal seigneuries were owned by the crown. These local representative agents would collect the rents and ensure that the development responsibilities were met. This was a much more state-centered system of land custodianship than the norms in Quebec proper, where the system was built on large landowners. It was also a system that was deeply unpopular among the English settlers. They were coming out of the township settlement model of New England, where townships were corporate entities that held responsibilities for development that were owed to the Crown, but were built not on rents to landlords, but on individual land ownership by resident farmers, who would pay tax to the Crown. Townships would also include formal town councils, more organized and authoritative than the seigneurial tenant associations which lobbied the Crown in Quebec. The royal seigneuries quickly gave way to township councils, and both Crown agents and settlers were more inclined to support this traditional English system of land tenure. The Quebec Act made guarantees for the old French system, but this was the beginning of a very separate system of land use in the United Provinces of Quebec. Another feature of land use was the institution of glebes. Glebes were districts within these townships and seigneuries that were given over to churches for development. Commonly, this was pasture land or minor farmland, and it was given to the local pastor for income by either working it directly or renting it out. Most of the glebes in the Loyalist communities were Anglican, but efforts were made to cluster different religious groups together and offer land for town churches that represented the respective faith of the settlers. A good example of this would be in the Glengarry district, where Presbyterian and Roman Catholic communities were settled with Scots Loyalists of different faiths, so that both might ease their access to their own churches. In 1784, Governor-General of Canada, Sir Frederick Haldimand, ordered the establishment of 8 townships to be founded as royal seigneuries. These were to be established far to the west of the last of the great seigneuries at Longueuil, just across the river from Montreal. These townships were imaginatively named 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. 5 years later, in 1789, those numbers would be dropped in favor of the names of members of the royal family, going from east to west as Charlottenburg, Cornwall, Osnabrück, Williamsburg, Matilda, Edwardsburg, Augusta, and Elizabethtown. Lake Township, later renamed Lancaster, was established to the east of those 8. Of these, Cornwall, Osnabrück, Augusta, and Lancaster still keep their names. The others have been changed, or the settlements abandoned in the flow of time. Further west, past Elizabethtown, 5 more townships were dedicated between Kingston and the Bay of Quinte. Like the 8 upriver, they started with numbers and later adopted names. This time, starting with Kingston, then Ernestown, Fredericksburg, Adolphustown, Marysburg, with all still existing except for Marysburg. By reading those names, you might recall that George III, the King of Great Britain and Ireland, was also the Prince-Elector of Hanover in the Holy Roman Empire, now Germany. In fact, in 1814 he would add the title King of Hanover to his monikers. His family was the House of Hanover, and despite being born in London and speaking English as his first language, he and his family were of a very German disposition. At the western edge of the 5 Quinte settlements came another land grant, stretching north from the Bay of Quinte as a land grant to the Mohawk who had sided with the Crown during the American War of Independence. This 12 by 13 district was granted to John Desserontion and named Tyendinaga. Desserontion was a Mohawk commissioned captain in New York State and fought in the defense of Quebec. Nearby Desseronto, Ontario, is named after him. Tyendinaga remains as unceded Mohawk territory to this day. Another significant Mohawk who received substantive land grant in Ontario in the wake of the American War of Independence was Joseph Brant, also known by his Iroquoian name, Tyendinaga. Here we run into some issues of transliteration, in that there are a great many alternate spellings of both the Haudenosaunee and the English version of the man's name. Tyendinaga is named after Tyendinaga, as is the Tyendinaga neighborhood in Burlington. Brantford, Ontario, and Brant Hospital in Burlington are also named after him, as are Brant Streets in Toronto and Burlington. In Ottawa, you can see a life-size statue of Tyendinaga in the Valiance Memorials on the East Walkway of the War Memorial. For his and his people's service to the Crown, Brant was given territory to administer on behalf of the Haudenosaunee on the Grand River in southern Ontario, in what's now called the Six Nations Reserve. It was settled by Brant with volunteers from his regiment in the war, representing the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee, and a handful of the Delaware, and even some white volunteers who had served under Brant. Deseronto and Brant conflicted over the distance between the two respective reserves. Brant thought that Haudenosaunee should cluster together to make a more cohesive demographic nation rather than spread out. Deseronto thought that giving non-Haudenosaunee lands within the reserve was more dangerous than the distance, and leasing or selling land would be a short-term gain for long-term instability. Governor-General Haldimand and Brant agreed that the entire Grand River Valley should be given to Brant and his settlers as compensation for their participation in the war, but the land was not unclaimed at the time. It was to be purchased from the Mississauga of the Credit for 1,180 pounds sterling. At the time, it was for a promise of 950,000 acres, but over time, pieces of this land were parceled off, some as rentals and some as freehold sales. This led to the ongoing Grand River land dispute, still not settled. Indigenous land rights is a theme that we'll be exploring later, and unfortunately often, as it has yet to be amicably resolved to the satisfaction of all stakeholders. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of the Ottawa History Hub podcast. This show is written, recorded, and produced by me, Brendan Ray. Please check out our website at ottawahistoryhub.com, and please take a minute to leave a review or a rating wherever you download this from. You can email me directly at ottawahistoryhub.com. Check it out on Facebook or Blue Sky at Ottawa History Hub, or X Twitter at OttHistoryHub. In our next episode, we are going to look at some of the families that settled along what was to become the Rideau Waterway, leading from Kingston northwards to the Ottawa River. Until then, everyone take care, advance Ottawa, en avant!